September the 9th AD. The mist hung thick over the Teutoburg Forest, turning ancient oaks into ghostly sentinels and reducing visibility to barely 20 paces. Publius Quinctilius Varus, governor of Germania and commander of 3 full Roman legions, rode near the head of a column that stretched for nearly 15 miles through the narrow forest path. The 55-year-old senator turned general had every reason to feel confident. Behind him marched approximately 15,000 legionaries, the finest infantry in the world, supported by 3,000 cavalry and an additional 10,000 camp followers, families, merchants, and slaves. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions represented the peak of Roman military might, each unit a veteran formation that had conquered from Hispania to Syria. What Varus didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined as he picked his way through the increasingly treacherous terrain, was that he was leading his army into the most catastrophic military defeat in Roman history. Within 3 days, 3 entire legions would cease to exist, wiped from the rolls of the Roman army forever. The military disaster would be so complete, so psychologically devastating, that Augustus Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, would reportedly bash his head against the palace walls, crying out, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The events that led to the Teutoburg Forest massacre began not with military miscalculation, but with Roman hubris and a fundamental misunderstanding of the Germanic tribes they sought to subjugate. Following Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul, Rome had turned its attention eastward across the Rhine. The Romans viewed the Germanic tribes as barbarians, primitive peoples who would inevitably submit to Roman civilization, just as the Gauls had done. They were wrong. The architect of Rome's destruction was a man who understood both worlds perfectly. Arminius, known to the Germans as Hermann, was a prince of the Cherusci tribe who had been taken to Rome as a youth, possibly as a hostage to ensure his father's loyalty. In Rome, he received a proper education, learned Latin fluently, studied Roman military tactics, and most importantly, served as an officer in the Roman auxiliary forces. He commanded Germanic cavalry units, earning Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. To the Romans, Arminius represented their successful civilizing mission, a barbarian prince transformed into a loyal servant of Rome. They never suspected that behind his Roman manners and perfect Latin, Arminius harboured a burning resentment and a brilliant strategic mind. By AD 9, Arminius had returned to Germania, ostensibly to help Rome pacify his homeland. Varus, appointed governor just 2 years earlier, trusted Arminius completely. The young Germanic prince served as his primary advisor on tribal affairs, commanding auxiliary troops and providing intelligence on potential threats. This trust would prove fatal. Varus himself was a creature of Roman politics rather than a military man. He had married into Augustus's family, wedding the emperor's grandniece, a connection that brought him power, but not necessarily competence. His previous posting as governor of Syria had been marked by excessive taxation and heavy-handed administration. He had grown wealthy in the east, accustomed to governing civilized provinces where Roman authority was unquestioned. Germania was different. The territory between the Rhine and Elbe rivers was a patchwork of fierce tribal confederations who valued their independence above all else. The Germanic warriors were not the disciplined soldiers of eastern kingdoms, but rather fierce individualists who fought with terrifying ferocity when their freedom was threatened. Varus failed to grasp this fundamental difference. He attempted to govern Germania as he had Syria, imposing Roman law, collecting taxes, and adjudicating disputes according to Roman custom. The Germanic tribes, accustomed to their own ancient traditions, seethed with resentment. Arminius played his role perfectly. He appeared at Varus's side, seemingly the model of a Romanized barbarian, offering advice, commanding troops, and earning deeper trust with each passing month. But secretly, he was building a coalition. The Germanic tribes were notoriously fractious, constantly feuding among themselves. Arminius's genius was convincing them that Rome represented a greater threat than their traditional enemies. Through secret meetings in the depths of the German forests, Arminius brought together the Cherusci, Marsi, Chatti, Bructeri, and other tribes in a conspiracy of unprecedented scope. He shared everything he had learned about Roman tactics, their strengths, and critically, their weaknesses. The plan that emerged was brilliant in its simplicity. The legions were nearly invincible in open battle, their disciplined formations and superior equipment making them unbeatable on the field. But in the forests, stretched into a long, vulnerable column. Separated from their cavalry support and unable to form their traditional battle lines, the legions could be destroyed piecemeal. All Arminius needed was to lure Varus into the perfect killing ground. The opportunity came in early September of AD 9. Varus had established his main summer camp near the Eza River in the territory of the Cherushi, Arminius's own tribe. As autumn approached, the governor prepared to march his forces back to their winter quarters on the Rhine, a routine movement that should have been uneventful. Then Arminius brought word of a rebellion. A minor tribe to the north, he reported, had risen against Roman authority. The uprising was small, easily crushed by even a single legion, but it required immediate attention lest it spread to other tribes. Arminius volunteered to lead Varus by the quickest route to put down the rebellion. The path he proposed ran directly through the Teutoburg Forest. Several of Varus's officers expressed concern. Segestes, another Germanic, a noble who genuinely supported Rome, warned Varus explicitly that Arminius was planning treachery. He urged the governor to arrest the Cherushi prince immediately, but Varus, supremely confident in his own judgment and unwilling to believe that his trusted advisor could betray him, dismissed the warnings. How could a barbarian, even one trained in Rome, threaten the might of 3 legions? On September 9th, the Roman column entered the Teutoburg Forest. The army was not arrayed for battle, but stretched in a long, vulnerable line necessary for navigating the narrow forest paths. At the front marched auxiliary troops, mostly Germanic soldiers under Roman command. Behind them came elements of the 3 legions, interspersed with cavalry units, baggage trains carrying the legion standards and equipment, camp followers, and more legionaries. The entire column stretched for 15 to 20 miles, taking hours to pass any given point. The Romans had marched through such terrain before, but this time something was different. The path seemed unusually difficult, blocked by fallen trees that forced constant detours. The ground became increasingly boggy, sucking at the sandaled feet of the legionaries and bogging down wagons. Light rain began to fall, making the ground slicker and dampening bowstrings and leather armour. The Romans pressed on, unaware that every obstacle had been deliberately placed by Germanic warriors who shadowed their every move. The forest itself seemed alive with watchers. Germanic scouts tracked the column's progress, reporting back to Arminius, who had claimed he needed to scout ahead and had left Varus's side. The Roman governor, trusting as ever, had let him go. As the first day wore on, the column became increasingly disorganized. The terrain forced gaps between units. Baggage wagons broke down on the terrible paths, creating bottlenecks that further separated the legions. Officers began to feel uneasy, but military discipline held. These were veteran troops who had marched through worse conditions. They would reach clear ground, make camp, and sort themselves out. That night the Romans constructed a marching camp as they had been trained, digging ditches and raising earthen ramparts even in the terrible conditions. But they were scattered across multiple locations, unable to concentrate their forces. The baggage train, with its precious supplies and the sacred legion standards, was separated from much of the fighting force. Around them in the darkness, thousands of Germanic warriors gathered silently. The storm that had been building all day broke that night with full fury. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the forest floor to mud and making sleep impossible for the exhausted Romans. Lightning illuminated the forest in brief, terrifying flashes. To superstitious legionaries it seemed the gods themselves had turned against them. They were right to be afraid. At dawn, on September 10th, as the Romans broke camp and resumed their march, the attack began. It started with a few arrows shot from the forest, striking down legionaries seemingly at random. Then more arrows, followed by javelins hurled from the cover of the trees. Germanic warriors appeared like ghosts from the mist, struck down isolated soldiers, and vanished back into the forest before the Romans could respond. This was warfare unlike anything the legions had experienced. There was no battle line to form against, no enemy formation to charge. The attackers were everywhere and nowhere, striking from ambush and melting away before Roman discipline could be brought to bear. The Germans knew every path through the forest, had prepared their positions for weeks, and fought with the desperate fury of men defending their homeland. The Roman column tried to maintain formation, but the constant harassment made it impossible. Each attack forced stops, detours, defensive formations that then had to be abandoned to continue the march. The Germans targeted officers specifically, recognizing them by their distinctive armor and plumes. Centurions, the backbone of legion discipline, fell to aimed spear throws and arrow volleys. Without their leaders, the legionaries began to panic. Varus, finally understanding the full scope of the disaster unfolding around him, tried to organize a defense, but his army was spread over miles of forest, separated by terrain, unable to communicate or coordinate. The German attacks intensified throughout the day. Germanic warriors, fighting in small groups rather than mass formations, used tactics that negated every Roman advantage. They struck at the baggage train, slaughtering the camp followers and capturing supplies. They ambushed cavalry units in narrow defiles where horses became liabilities rather than assets. They targeted the flanks of the marching column, preventing any attempt to form a proper battle line. The Romans fought back with desperate courage. Legionaries trained to fight in formation struggled to adapt to this new type of warfare. Small groups would form defensive squares when attacked, presenting shields on all sides. But these formations couldn't move quickly through the forest, and were bypassed by the more mobile Germans who struck at easier targets. By nightfall of the second day, the Roman army had disintegrated into isolated pockets of survivors struggling through the forest. Casualties numbered in the thousands, but worse than the dead were the wounded. Unable to carry injured comrades, weakened by lack of food and water, the Romans were forced into terrible decisions. The wounded who couldn't walk were abandoned, often begging their comrades to end their suffering rather than leave them for the Germans. That second night, Varus attempted to gather what remained of his forces on a low hill that offered some defensive advantage. Perhaps 10,000 men managed to reach this position, less than half the legionaries who had entered the forest 2 days earlier. They built crude fortifications, but they had lost most of their tools with the baggage train. The sacred eagle standards of the 17th, 18th and 19th legions were still with them, the greatest disgrace being to lose these symbols of Roman power. The Germans surrounded the position but didn't attack directly. Why assault a fortified position when time and starvation would do the work for them? All through the night, the Romans could hear the screams of wounded comrades being killed by the Germans, a psychological warfare that eroded whatever morale remained. At dawn on September 11th, in desperation, Varus ordered a breakout attempt. The survivors would abandon the baggage, abandon the wounded, and make a desperate dash for the Rhine, still dozens of miles away. Perhaps speed and surprise would carry them through. It was a futile hope. As the Romans emerged from their crude fortifications, the Germans fell upon them like wolves on wounded prey. The legionaries, exhausted, hungry and demoralized, could offer only token resistance. Units broke apart under the assault. Soldiers fled individually into the forest, hunted down and killed. The proud formations that had conquered the known world dissolved into a panicked mob. Varus, seeing the complete destruction of his command, chose the Roman way out. Rather than face capture and the humiliation that would follow, he fell on his sword. Several of his senior officers did the same. Command of what little remained fell to junior officers who had no illusions about survival. Some small groups of legionaries did manage to fight their way out of the forest, their stories providing the only Roman accounts of the disaster. Cassius Dio, writing 2 centuries later, described their testimony. The Romans suffered greatly from the terrain, the forest, and the enemy. They could not properly deploy their forces. They could not throw their javelins effectively. They could not use their swords to advantage. The shields could not protect them because they were constantly being struck from behind and from the sides. They were crowded together, making it easy for the Germans to attack from all sides. The rain added to their troubles, making it hard to maintain footing and to wield weapons. The Germans, on the other hand, were on familiar ground. They moved easily through the forest. Their lighter arms and armour were better suited to the terrain. The massacre continued throughout that final day. By nightfall, organised Roman resistance had ceased to exist. Small groups of survivors, numbering perhaps a few hundred total out of more than 20,000 who had entered the forest, fled westward. Most would die in the following days, hunted through the forests or dying of wounds and exposure. A handful, no more than a few dozen, eventually reached Roman outposts on the Rhine, bringing news of the catastrophe. The Germanic tribes had achieved the impossible. They had annihilated 3 Roman legions, the first time such a disaster had befallen Roman arms since Hannibal's victory at Cannae more than 200 years earlier. The numbers were staggering. Of approximately 15,000 legionaries, fewer than 100 survived. 3,000 cavalry destroyed, 10,000 camp followers killed or enslaved. 3 legion eagles, the sacred standards that embodied the honour and soul of each legion, captured by the barbarians. It was a catastrophe beyond measure. The aftermath of the battle was, if possible, even more horrific than the fighting itself. Arminius, securing his position as leader of the tribal coalition, ordered a ritual sacrifice. Roman prisoners, including several high-ranking officers who had been captured alive, were brought to sacred groves in the forest. There they were sacrificed to the Germanic gods in ceremonies that combined religious ritual with political theatre. Some prisoners were burned alive in wicker cages, others were beheaded, their skulls nailed to trees as offerings to Woden. Senior officers were dragged to altars where priests cut out their hearts while they still lived. These sacrifices served multiple purposes. They honoured the Germanic gods who had granted victory. They reinforced the religious significance of the uprising, transforming it from a mere military victory into a holy war. And they sent a message that would echo through Germania. Rome could be defeated, Roman soldiers could be killed, Roman power was not invincible. The captured legion eagles were treated with particular significance. These standards, normally kept in the legion's most sacred shrine and defended to the death, represented the soul of each legion. Their capture was the ultimate disgrace. Arminius had them placed in Germanic temples, physical proof that the Roman gods had abandoned their servants. In Rome, the news of the disaster arrived weeks later, brought by the few survivors who had managed to reach the Rhine and then travelled by fast ship to Italy. Augustus Caesar, 72 years old and nearing the end of his reign, was devastated. The ancient historian Suetonius recorded that the emperor was so greatly affected that for several months he cut neither his beard nor his hair, and sometimes he would dash his head against a door, crying, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." The loss of 3 legions, fully 1/9 of Rome's entire military establishment, was catastrophic. But the psychological impact was even worse. Rome's aura of invincibility had been shattered. If Germanic barbarians could destroy 3 legions, what other subject peoples might be inspired to rebel? The disaster forced a complete reassessment of Roman strategy in Germania. Augustus, in one of his final acts before his death in AD 14, abandoned plans to extend Roman control beyond the Rhine. The river would become Rome's permanent frontier in the north. Germania beyond the Rhine would remain free, a constant reminder of Roman limitations. The military response was immediate but cautious. Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and eventual successor, took personal command of forces on the Rhine. Rather than seek immediate vengeance, he focused on securing the frontier, building fortifications and restoring the shaken morale of the frontier legions. The destroyed legion numbers 17, 18 and 19 were retired forever, never to be used again. 6 years passed before Rome attempted to avenge the Teutoburg Forest. In AD 15, Germanicus Caesar, nephew of Emperor Tiberius, and one of Rome's most capable generals, launched a major expedition across the Rhine. His objectives were clear: punish the Germanic tribes, recover the lost eagle standards, and restore Roman honour. Germanicus commanded 8 legions, supported by numerous auxiliary units and river fleets, the largest Roman army assembled since the civil wars. His campaign was methodical and brutal. Rather than chase Germanic warriors through the forests where they held every advantage, Germanicus used Roman engineering and logistics to project power deep into tribal territories. His forces moved along river valleys, building fortified supply bases, devastating tribal lands with fire and sword. The Romans couldn't catch the mobile Germanic warriors in decisive battle, but they could destroy their crops, burn their villages, and slaughter their families. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Germanicus wanted the tribes to understand that Roman revenge, while delayed, was inevitable and terrible. In AD 16, Germanicus's forces reached the Teutoburg Forest. What they found haunted them for the rest of their lives. The Roman historian Tacitus, whose father-in-law Agricola served in the legions, recorded the scene based on eyewitness accounts. In the middle of the field were the whitening bones of men, as they had fled or stood their ground, strewn everywhere or piled in heaps. Near lay fragments of weapons and limbs of horses, and also human heads, prominently nailed to trunks of trees. In the adjacent groves were the barbarous altars on which they had immolated tribunes and first-rank centurions. 6 years after the battle, The remains of nearly 20,000 Romans still littered the forest floor. The Germans had left them unburied, a deliberate insult to Roman custom, which held that unburied dead could not find peace in the afterlife. Germanicus ordered his men to gather and bury the bones with full military honours. Entire legions wept as they collected the remains of comrades they had known, giving them the funeral rites that had been denied for so long. The eagle standards, however, remained lost. Germanicus's campaigns over the next 2 years were successful in military terms. His legions won several battles against Germanic forces, including a significant victory at Edistoviso, where Roman discipline prevailed in open battle. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Germans could always retreat deeper into their vast forests, while the Romans were limited by their supply lines and the season. In AD 16, Germanicus's forces recovered the eagle of the 19th Legion from the Bructeri tribe. The following year they recovered the eagle of the 17th from the Marsi. These recoveries were celebrated in Rome with triumphs and public rejoicing, tangible proof that Roman honour had been restored. The eagle of the 18th Legion was never found, though reports suggested it had been taken beyond the Elbe, far outside the reach of Roman power. But even with 2 eagles recovered and several successful campaigns completed, Tiberius recalled Germanicus in AD 17. The emperor had concluded what Augustus had realised before him: Germania could not be conquered. The cost in men, money, and time was too high. The Rhine would remain the frontier. Rome would defend but not expand. Arminius, the architect of Rome's greatest defeat, did not long enjoy his triumph. The coalition he had built fell apart almost immediately after the Roman withdrawal. The Germanic tribes returned to their traditional rivalries and feuds. Arminius attempted to establish himself as king of the Cherusci, but his people, fiercely independent, rejected any authority that resembled Roman-style monarchy. In AD 21, just 12 years after his great victory, Arminius was assassinated by members of his own tribe who feared he sought too much power. He was 37 years old. Tacitus, writing decades later, provided Arminius's epitaph. Without doubt Germania's liberator, who had challenged the Roman people not in its beginnings like other kings and commanders, but in the peak of its empire. In battles he was undecided, in war undefeated. He lived 37 years, ruling for 12, and is still celebrated in tribal songs, though unknown to Greek historians who admire only their own, and even little regarded by Romans who prize the ancient past but neglect modern times. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest's strategic consequences echoed for centuries. Rome never again seriously attempted to conquer Germania east of the Rhine. The frontier established after the disaster remained essentially unchanged for the next 400 years until the Western Roman Empire collapsed. The boundary between Roman civilization and Germanic freedom, between Latin and German languages, between Mediterranean and Northern European cultures, was effectively drawn in that forest in AD 9. The loss of population was significant, but not devastating to Rome's overall military capability. The empire had approximately 250,000 soldiers under arms. Losing 15,000 legionaries was painful, but not catastrophic in numerical terms. Within a few years, Rome had recruited and trained replacements, but the psychological damage persisted. The disaster demonstrated that Rome's armies were not invincible. More importantly, it showed that barbarian peoples, if properly led and fighting on favourable terrain, could defeat the legions. This lesson was not lost on other peoples along Rome's vast frontiers. The tactics Arminius employed, using mobility and terrain to neutralise Rome's advantages in equipment and discipline, would be studied and employed by other enemies. The Dacians, the Parthians, and eventually the Germanic tribes who would end the Western Empire all learned from Teutoburg that Rome could be beaten. The battlefield itself became a place of terrible memory. Roman soldiers posted to the Rhine frontier told stories of the haunted forest, where the screams of the dead could still be heard on certain nights. Germanic tribes considered it sacred ground, a place where the gods had demonstrated their favour. Archaeological evidence suggests the site remained important for centuries. Modern archaeology has transformed our understanding of the battle. For centuries, the exact location of the Teutoburg Forest battle was unknown. The ancient sources provided general descriptions, but no precise location. Various sites in northern Germany were proposed, but none conclusively proven. In 1987, British Army officer and amateur archaeologist Tony Clun, stationed in Germany, began metal detecting around the town of Kalkries, following clues from ancient sources. His discoveries, followed by systematic archaeological excavation, revealed the battle site. Over 6,000 artifacts have been recovered, including coins dated to Augustus's reign, military equipment, weapons, human and animal bones, and most dramatically, a silver facial mask from a Roman cavalry helmet, its expression frozen in what might be mistaken for a scream. The archaeological evidence confirms the ancient accounts. The battlefield shows evidence of earthworks constructed by the Germans to channel the Roman column into kill zones. The Romans were forced through a narrow passage between a hill and a large bog, unable to deploy properly, subject to attack from above. The distribution of artifacts shows the Roman column stretched over several miles, exactly as described by ancient sources. The finds include personal items, a seal ring with the name of someone named Aulus, coins that soldiers carried, small statues of gods carried for protection, all the intimate debris of a catastrophic defeat. Perhaps most moving are the marks of violence on the artifacts themselves. Weapons show battle damage. Helmets are crushed or pierced. Bones show evidence of sword cuts and blunt force trauma. A particularly haunting find is a skull with clear evidence of beheading, likely from the ritual sacrifices. The physical evidence brings the ancient accounts to terrible life. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest has resonated through history in ways its participants could never have imagined. In the 19th century, as German nationalism grew, Arminius was adopted as a national hero. The Hermannsdenkmal, a massive monument erected near the supposed battle site in 1875, depicts Arminius raising his sword toward France, the modern equivalent of Rome. The inscription reads, "German unity, my strength, Germany's might." This nationalist interpretation of the battle portrayed it as the moment when Germanic freedom defeated foreign tyranny, a narrative that would be exploited and distorted for political purposes well into the 20th century. Modern historians take a more nuanced view. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest was neither the first nor the last Roman military disaster. Rome had suffered defeats before and would suffer others afterward. But it was significant in marking the permanent limit of Roman expansion in northern Europe. The battle established a cultural and linguistic frontier that persists to this day. The Rhine River remains a significant cultural boundary within Europe, dividing Romance language speakers from Germanic language speakers, territories that were Romanized from those that never were. The military lessons of Teutoburg Forest were studied by professional soldiers for centuries. The danger of operating in terrain that negated your advantages, the importance of intelligence and understanding your enemy, the vulnerability of armies when strung out on the march. These lessons were written in Roman blood in that German forest. Every military academy in the modern world teaches these same principles, often without realizing they are studying lessons first taught in AD 9. The human cost of the battle is impossible to fully calculate. 15,000 legionaries killed in 3 days, plus thousands more cavalry and camp followers. Every one of them had a name, a family, a story. They were sons, fathers, brothers, men who had joined the legions for the pay and citizenship, who had marched from Spain to Syria and finally to a nameless forest in the north. Their bones lay scattered in the forest for 6 years before being gathered and given proper burial. 3,000 families received the devastating news that their sons and fathers would not return. The economic impact on the communities that supplied the legions was significant. The loss of the legion's payroll, the money that flowed into civilian economies around military bases, was felt for years. The 3 destroyed legions were never reformed. The units that replaced them bore different numbers, but everyone knew why numbers 17, 18 and 19 were retired. To speak those numbers was to recall the disaster, a collective trauma that persisted for generations. For the Germanic tribes, the victory came at a cost as well. The Roman reprisals under Germanicus were brutal. Entire tribal territories were devastated. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, populations massacred or enslaved. The victories of AD 15 and 16, while they did not lead to permanent Roman occupation, inflicted terrible casualties on the tribes. The cycle of violence and revenge consumed both sides for years. The recovered eagle standards of the 17th and 19th legions were displayed in triumph in Rome, tangible symbols that honour had been restored. But the eagle of the 18th legion remained lost somewhere beyond the Elbe, a permanent reminder of incomplete vengeance. German legend held that it was buried in a sacred grove, guarded by tribal priests, a trophy too precious to display openly. The lost eagle became a symbol in Roman consciousness, appearing in literature and art, representing both defeat and the incompleteness of Roman power. The empire that controlled most of the known world could not recover a single piece of gilded bronze from the barbarians who had taken it. The veterans who survived the battle, the handful who made it back to Roman lines, carried physical and psychological scars for life. In a culture that celebrated military valour, they faced difficult questions. How had they survived when so many had died? Had they fought bravely or fled in panic? The ancient world had no concept of post-traumatic stress, but the symptoms described by ancient sources, nightmares, emotional outbursts, inability to function in civilian life, are readily recognizable today. Some survivors rebuilt their lives, re-enlisting in new units, driven by a desire for revenge. Others could never escape the forest, spending their remaining years as broken men, haunted by memories of slaughter and betrayal. Their stories, fragmentary and incomplete in the historical record, hint at the psychological cost of Rome's worst military disaster. The battle fundamentally changed Roman military policy. Never again would Rome commit 3 full legions to a single column deep in hostile territory. New protocols for march security, reconnaissance, and communication were implemented. The disaster became a case study in military planning, an example of everything that could go wrong when a commander ignored intelligence, underestimated his enemy, and allowed himself to be led into unfavourable terrain. Future Roman generals studied the Varian disaster, learning from Varus's mistakes. The emphasis on engineering, on building roads and fortified camps even in hostile territory increased. The Romans became more cautious in their expansion, more careful in their assessment of enemy capabilities. The confident assumption of Roman superiority that had characterized earlier conquests gave way to a more measured, professional approach to warfare. The frontier along the Rhine became Rome's most militarized border. At its peak, 8 legions, nearly a third of Rome's total military force, were stationed along the Rhine and Upper Danube. This massive military presence, sustained for centuries, was a direct consequence of Teutoburg Forest. Rome never forgot that beyond the river lay tribes capable of destroying legions. The economic cost of maintaining this frontier was enormous. The legions required pay, equipment, supplies, all of which had to be transported from the Mediterranean heartland to the cold northern frontier. The river fleet needed to patrol the Rhine, the fortifications that eventually stretched from the North Sea to the Alps, the roads, bridges, and supply depots, all represented a massive diversion of resources driven by the fear that another Teutoburg Forest could occur if vigilance slacked. The battle also affected Roman politics. Augustus's settlement, the political arrangements that had ended the civil wars and established the Principate, had been predicated on continuous expansion. The emperor's legitimacy derived partly from military success, from expanding Rome's territory and bringing glory to the empire. Teutoburg Forest demonstrated the limits of expansion. There were frontiers that could not be crossed, enemies that could not be defeated. This realization contributed to the evolution of Roman grand strategy from one of expansion to one of defense and frontier maintenance. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine remained a constant concern for Roman strategists. They could not be conquered, but neither could they be ignored. Roman policy evolved toward a combination of military deterrence, diplomacy, and economic penetration. Trade across the frontier increased. Roman goods flowed into Germania, creating economic dependencies that sometimes served Roman interests better than military conquest. The tribal politics of Germania became a subject of intense Roman interest. Roman agents and spies operated beyond the frontier, gathering intelligence, fostering divisions among tribes, supporting Roman-friendly leaders, and undermining potential threats. This intelligence apparatus, born from the failure to detect Arminius's conspiracy, became a permanent feature of Roman frontier policy. Some tribes were brought into the Roman military system as auxiliaries, serving in units stationed far from their homelands. This policy both removed potential warriors from Germania and created bonds of interest between tribal elites and Rome. Many Germanic nobles received Roman citizenship, Roman education, and Roman wealth in exchange for military service. It was the same policy that had created Arminius, but with more careful safeguards. The irony was not lost on Roman observers. The system that had produced Rome's greatest enemy continued because it served Rome's military needs. The empire required manpower, and the hardy warriors of Germania provided excellent soldiers, provided they were carefully integrated, closely watched, and kept far from their homelands. The Teutoburg Forest disaster cast a long shadow over this policy, but practical military necessity overrode the cautious warnings of history. The cultural impact of the battle extended beyond military affairs. Roman literature was filled with references to the Germanic forests portrayed as dark, mysterious, dangerous places where civilization ended and barbarism began. The forests became a literary trope, a symbol of everything that lay beyond Roman control. Writers described them as places of horror, inhabited by savage peoples who practiced human sacrifice and lived like animals. This stereotype, born partly from the trauma of Teutoburg Forest, influenced European attitudes toward forests and their inhabitants for centuries. The Romans, Mediterranean people, accustomed to sun and open spaces, found something fundamentally unsettling about the dense forests of the north. The Germans, equally, began to see the forest as a source of their strength and identity. The place where they had defeated Rome became a symbol of freedom and independence. This cultural association between Germanic peoples and forests would persist in myth and literature for millennia. The battle also affected Roman religion and superstition. The disaster was seen by many as a sign of divine disfavour. Various explanations circulated. Augustus had offended the gods through excessive pride. Varus had somehow incurred divine wrath. The legion standards had not been properly consecrated. These religious interpretations competed with more practical military assessments, creating a complex discourse about divine will and human agency in military affairs. Commemorations of the fallen became important civic rituals. Monuments were erected, sacrifices performed, the anniversary of the disaster marked with solemn ceremonies. These rituals served multiple purposes, honouring the dead, asserting Roman strength despite the defeat, and warning against complacency and hubris. The memory of the disaster was deliberately kept alive as a cautionary tale. For the Germanic tribes, the battle became a founding myth, a moment when unified Germanic action had achieved the impossible. The problem was that this unity proved impossible to maintain. Almost immediately after the Roman withdrawal, the tribal coalition dissolved into mutual recriminations and renewed warfare. The Germans proved better at fighting Romans than at building lasting political structures. This failure to capitalize on their military success, to transform battlefield victory into political unification, would characterize Germanic history for centuries. The potential for what might have been a united Germanic state on Rome's frontier was never realized. Instead, the tribes remained fragmented, occasionally dangerous to Rome, but never capable of sustained offensive action. In the centuries following Teutoburg Forest, Germanic tribes would continue to interact with Rome through a complex mixture of warfare, trade, and diplomacy. Some tribes migrated westward, crossing the Rhine in the declining years of the Western Empire, not as invaders but as refugees seeking land and security. The final collapse of Roman power in the West in the 5th century AD came partly from these Germanic migrations, as tribes like the Vandals, Visigoths, and Franks moved into former Roman territories. The descendants of the warriors who had fought at Teutoburg Forest eventually inherited the western half of the Roman Empire, not through military conquest, but through a gradual process of integration and Roman decline. The successor kingdoms established by Germanic peoples retained many Roman institutions while infusing them with Germanic customs and traditions. The cultural synthesis that emerged from this fusion shaped medieval Europe. In many ways, the Germanic victory at Teutoburg Forest, which established that Germania would not be conquered and Romanized like Gaul, preserved Germanic culture and institutions that would later profoundly influence European development. The Roman legal tradition mixed with Germanic customary law, Latin language interacted with Germanic tongues, producing eventually the Romance and Germanic language families. Roman Christianity adapted to Germanic cultural patterns. The Europe that emerged from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire was neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but a synthesis of both. And the line of division, the place where Roman and Germanic cultures met and mixed rather than one simply overwhelming the other, was largely determined in AD 9 in the Teutoburg Forest. The battle's ultimate historical significance thus extends far beyond its immediate military consequences. It represented a limit to Roman expansion, a boundary beyond which Mediterranean civilization could not extend unchanged. but it also established a dynamic frontier zone where two very different cultures interacted, competed, and eventually synthesized into something new. The modern nations of Germany, France, and the Low Countries owe their linguistic and cultural identities partly to decisions made and blood spilled in that forest over 2,000 years ago. In AD 9, Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 Roman legions into the Teutoburg Forest, confident in Roman superiority, trusting in his Germanic advisor, expecting a routine march to a minor rebellion. 3 days later, he was dead, his army annihilated, and 3 legion eagles captured by the barbarians he had so completely underestimated. The confidence that had led him into the forest, the cultural arrogance that prevented him from seeing Arminius's betrayal, the assumptions of Roman invincibility that clouded his judgment, all were buried with the thousands who fell in those 3 terrible days. The Battle of Teutoburg Forest stands as one of history's most complete military disasters, not merely because of the casualties, though they were catastrophic, but because of the psychological and strategic consequences. Rome, the most powerful empire in the ancient world, learned that there were limits to its power. Germania would remain free, a constant reminder on Rome's northern frontier that some peoples could not be conquered, some territories could not be absorbed into the imperial system. The Germanic warriors who ambushed the legions in those dark forests fought with the desperate courage of men defending their freedom. They were not the organized, disciplined soldiers of Rome, but they possessed something equally valuable: intimate knowledge of the terrain, burning motivation, and a brilliant commander who understood both Germanic warfare and Roman tactics. Arminius, trained in Rome, trusted by Rome, and ultimately Rome's destroyer, represents one of history's most successful practitioners of asymmetric warfare. The irony is profound. Rome's policy of educating and training barbarian nobles, intended to create loyal servants of the empire, produced instead the architect of Rome's greatest defeat. The Romans never learned this lesson completely. Throughout the empire's remaining centuries, they continued to recruit barbarians, train them in Roman methods, and place them in positions of trust. Sometimes this policy worked brilliantly, producing loyal soldiers and capable administrators. But the shadow of Arminius hung over the practice, a warning that barbarians given Roman training might turn those skills against their teachers. The standard narrative of the Teutoburg Forest focuses on Roman hubris and Germanic cunning. But the deeper story is about the collision of 2 fundamentally different military systems and cultures. Rome represented organized, professional, systematic warfare. Germanic warriors embodied individual valor, mobility, and intimate connection to their native landscape. In the open field, Roman organization usually triumphed. In the forests of Germania, fighting on familiar ground with every advantage of terrain and surprise, the Germanic warriors proved that Rome's system had exploitable weaknesses. Modern military theorists study Teutoburg Forest as an example of successful irregular warfare against a conventional force. The tactics Arminius employed, using terrain to neutralize the enemy's strengths, employing mobility and surprise, targeting command and control, creating psychological pressure through continuous harassment, these are recognized today as fundamental principles of guerrilla warfare. That they were employed so successfully over 2,000 years ago demonstrates that certain military truths are timeless. The archaeological evidence recovered from Calcarees provides intimate glimpses into the human reality of the battle. Among the thousands of artifacts are small personal items, a soldier's good luck charm, a coin carried for years, a seal ring with a name. These objects, lost in the chaos of battle, represent individual human beings whose stories ended violently in that forest. Each artifact is a silent memorial to someone who marched confidently into the forest and never emerged. The most haunting aspect of the archaeological evidence is its violent character. Weapons show battle damage, helmets are crushed, bones reveal fatal wounds. The physical evidence confirms what the ancient sources describe: a massacre conducted over several days, Roman soldiers dying in their thousands, some in organized resistance, others fleeing in panic, all overwhelmed by an enemy they had underestimated until it was far too late. The silver cavalry mask found at Calcarees, with its serene classical features, provides a strange contrast to the violence it witnessed. This beautiful object, meant to protect and inspire awe, was discarded in the panic of defeat, trampled into the mud where it lay hidden for 2,000 years. When archaeologists cleaned and conserved it, They revealed an artifact that had adorned a Roman cavalryman who almost certainly died in the battle. His name is unknown, his bones probably scattered and lost, but his mask survived to bear witness to the disaster. The psychological impact on Roman society cannot be overstated. Rome had suffered defeats before. Crassus's legions had been destroyed by the Parthians at Carrhae in 53 BC. Various commanders had lost battles and armies. But Teutoburg Forest was different. It occurred in a territory Rome considered pacified, conducted by peoples Rome viewed as conquered, led by a man Rome had trusted. The betrayal aspect amplified the trauma beyond a simple military defeat. Augustus's reported reaction, beating his head against the walls and crying for Varus to return his legions, whether literally true or dramatic embellishment by ancient historians, captures the emotional devastation. The emperor who had brought peace to the Mediterranean world, who had expanded Rome's frontiers and secured its borders, saw in his final years the complete destruction of 3 legions and the collapse of an entire strategic plan. The German frontier would remain unstable and dangerous for the rest of his life. The decision to retire the numbers of the destroyed legions permanently was unprecedented. Roman legions were normally reformed after defeats, their numbers preserved to maintain continuity. By abolishing the 17th, 18th and 19th legions, Rome acknowledged that this defeat was different, so complete that even the institutional memory of these units had to be erased. Yet paradoxically, this very act of erasure ensured the disaster would be remembered. The missing numbers in the legion sequence served as a permanent reminder of what had been lost. Tiberius's cautious strategy following the disaster demonstrated Rome's fundamental strategic shift. Rather than seek immediate revenge through large-scale offensive operations, Rome focused on securing what it held. The Rhine frontier was reinforced, fortifications strengthened, intelligence gathering improved. The punitive campaigns under Germanicus were carefully controlled, designed to restore Roman prestige and recover the lost eagles, but not to repeat Varus's mistake of overextending into hostile territory. The recovery of 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards represented partial redemption for Rome. These were not mere military insignia but sacred objects, blessed by priests, carried in religious ceremonies, and defended to the death. Their loss was both military disgrace and religious catastrophe. Each eagle housed the spirit of its legion, and its capture meant that spirit was in enemy hands. The ceremonies in Rome when the recovered eagles were returned, the triumphal processions, the religious rites of purification and rededication, were attempts to heal a spiritual wound as much as to celebrate a military success. The eagle of the 18th Legion, never recovered, became a symbol in Roman consciousness. Various explanations circulated about its fate. Some said it was buried in a Germanic holy place, others that it had been destroyed in ritual sacrifice, still others that it had been taken far beyond the Elbe into territories Rome would never reach. The lost eagle represented incomplete vengeance, a permanent reminder that not everything taken from Rome could be recovered. For Germanic culture, the battle should have been a unifying moment, proof that the tribes together could defeat any enemy. But the political fragmentation that characterized Germanic society prevented this unity from lasting. Within years of the victory, the coalition had fractured, tribes returned to traditional rivalries, and the chance to capitalize on the military success was lost. This pattern would repeat throughout Germanic history. Tactical brilliance and fierce warrior culture could win battles but could not create lasting political structures. Arminius's assassination by his own people in AD 21 epitomized this problem. The man who had saved Germania from Roman conquest was killed because his fellow tribesmen feared he would become what they most despised, a king with power over free warriors. The irony was bitter. Arminius had fought to preserve Germanic freedom and was killed because he seemed to threaten that same freedom. His death ensured that no similar leader would unite the tribes for centuries to come. The long-term consequences of Teutoburg Forest shaped European history in ways that became clear only centuries later. By establishing that Germanic territories beyond the Rhine would remain outside direct Roman control, the battle preserved Germanic culture, language, and institutions. These would later influence the development of medieval Europe, when Germanic peoples moved into former Roman territories during the empire's decline. The frontier established after Teutoburg Forest created a border zone where different cultures met and interacted. Along the Rhine, Roman and Germanic peoples traded, fought, negotiated, and gradually influenced each other. Roman goods flowed into Germania, Germanic warriors served in Roman armies, and a hybrid culture began developing in the frontier regions. This cultural mixing zone would eventually produce the medieval kingdoms that succeeded the Western Roman Empire. The military lessons of Teutoburg Forest influenced Roman tactics for centuries. The disaster demonstrated the danger of underestimating barbarian enemies, of operating in unfavourable terrain, of allowing armies to become strung out and vulnerable. Later Roman commanders studied the disaster, learning from Varus's mistakes. The increasingly defensive character of Roman strategy, the focus on fortified frontiers rather than aggressive expansion, owed much to the lessons written in blood in the Teutoburg Forest. The battle also demonstrated the limits of training and technology against determined resistance, fighting on home ground. The Roman legionaries were better trained, better equipped, and more disciplined than their Germanic opponents. Under normal circumstances, these advantages were decisive, but in the forests, separated from their supports, unable to employ their normal tactics, the legionaries discovered that superior training and equipment could not overcome every disadvantage. This lesson about the importance of terrain and local knowledge remained relevant through every subsequent era of military history. The human cost of the disaster extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The survivors carried psychological scars that affected them for life. The families of the dead faced economic hardship and social stigma. The communities that had supplied the destroyed legions suffered economic disruption as military pay and contracts disappeared. The ripple effects of the disaster touched thousands of lives across the Roman world. For the Germanic tribes, the victory came at a cost that became apparent only later. The Roman reprisals under Germanicus were brutal and systematic. While they did not result in permanent conquest, they inflicted tremendous casualties and destruction. Entire tribal territories were devastated, their populations killed or enslaved, their lands wasted. The cycle of violence initiated at Teutoburg Forest continued for years, consuming both sides. The recovered artifacts from Calcaries continue to yield information as archaeological techniques improve. Modern analysis of metal composition traces weapons to specific Roman workshops. Study of skeletal remains reveals information about the ages, health, and manner of death of those who fell. Ongoing excavation continues to expand understanding of the battle, revealing the extent of the killing ground and the desperation of the Roman defence. Each new discovery adds detail to our understanding, but also raises questions. How many of those who fell were veteran legionaries, and how many were recent recruits? What percentage died fighting versus those who were killed while fleeing? How many were captured alive and later sacrificed in Germanic religious ceremonies? The incomplete archaeological record can only partially answer these questions, leaving much to informed speculation based on what evidence survives. The site itself is now a place of memory and interpretation. The museum and Park Calcaries presents the archaeological findings and tells the story of the battle to modern visitors. Walking the terrain where the massacre occurred, visitors can understand viscerally how the landscape favoured the Germanic ambush. The narrow passage between hill and bog that channeled the Roman column into the killing zone remains clearly visible, a geographical trap that doomed Varus's army. Modern German attitudes toward the battle and its significance have evolved considerably. The 19th century nationalist interpretation that portrayed Arminius as a proto-German national hero has been largely abandoned by serious historians. Contemporary scholarship recognises that the battle involved tribal coalitions and Roman forces that bore little relationship to modern nation-states. The attempt to claim Arminius as a German national symbol is now recognised as anachronistic, projecting modern concepts of nationhood onto a tribal society that had no such conception. Yet the battle remains significant in German historical consciousness, not as nationalist mythology, but as a genuine turning point when Germanic peoples successfully resisted Roman conquest. The fact that lands east of the Rhine remained outside the Roman Empire shaped the historical development of Central Europe. Languages, legal traditions, and cultural patterns that developed in this unconquered territory differ in important ways from those in Romanized regions. The cultural geography of modern Europe still bears traces of divisions established over 2,000 years ago. For Rome, Teutoburg Forest became a defining trauma, a disaster studied and remembered as a warning against hubris and complacency. Roman writers returned to it repeatedly, analysing what went wrong, drawing moral and strategic lessons, using it as an example in discussions of military command and imperial policy. The battle entered Roman consciousness in a way that other defeats, some equally costly in immediate terms, did not. Something about the completeness of the disaster, the betrayal involved, and the psychological shock of defeat at the hands of supposed barbarians gave Teutoburg Forest a special place in Roman memory. The 3 days in September of AD 9, when 3 Roman legions entered the Teutoburg Forest and none returned, represent one of history's decisive moments. The battle did not end the Roman Empire, which would endure for centuries. It did not even end Roman power in Germania, which continued along the Rhine frontier. But it established permanent limits to Roman expansion, demonstrated that Rome's military might was not invincible, and preserved Germanic independence at a crucial moment. The ghosts of 20,000 Romans who died in that forest, their bones finally buried 6 years later by the horrified legionaries of Germanicus's army, represent the human cost of imperial ambition and cultural misunderstanding. Varus's trust in Arminius, born of Roman cultural arrogance that assumed barbarians would naturally embrace Roman civilization, led directly to the catastrophe. The failure to recognize that peoples might prefer their own freedom to Roman order, might value their own traditions over Roman civilization, might fight with desperate ferocity when threatened with conquest. These failures of understanding were as responsible for the disaster as any tactical mistakes. Arminius's brilliance lay not merely in military tactics, though his battle plan was masterful, but in his ability to unite traditionally fractious tribes against a common enemy. His understanding of both Germanic and Roman military cultures allowed him to exploit weaknesses in the Roman system that Roman commanders didn't recognize. His ultimate tragedy was that the political unity he forged for battle could not be sustained in peace, and the independence he fought to preserve eventually led to his own death at the hands of those he'd saved. The Teutoburg Forest stands in history as a place where imperial ambition met determined resistance, where cultural arrogance confronted fierce independence, where the legions that had conquered the Mediterranean world discovered there were forests they could not march through, peoples they could not subdue, enemies they could not defeat. 3 legions entered that forest in September of AD 9. None returned. Their fate shaped European history in ways that echo to the present day. The thunder of their destruction, the clash of arms and screams of dying men, faded long ago. But the consequences of those 3 days of slaughter continue to influence the world that emerged from the ruins of Rome's ambition.